I was sitting in my car outside a coffee shop in Tempe, Arizona, on a Tuesday afternoon, windows fogged from the rain, when a stranger opened my passenger door and dropped into the seat like he belonged there. He looked at me. I looked at him, and neither of us said a word for a full 5 seconds. If this story moves your heart, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss another story from us. It had been a strange week, and I don't mean that in a dramatic way. I mean the kind of strange where small things kept happening slightly out of order, like the universe was shuffling a deck of cards and hadn't quite decided what hand to deal me yet. My name is Wells Carver. I was 34 years old, living in Tempe, Arizona, working as a licensed solar installation project manager for a mid-sized renewable energy firm near the airport. It was not a glamorous job. It involved spreadsheets, site inspections, contractor calls, and a whole lot of standing in the direct Arizona sun squinting at rooftop angles. I was good at it. I was also, at that particular moment in my life, extremely alone, not lonely in a desperate way. More in a quiet way, the kind of alone that settles into your apartment like dust on a windowsill. You don't notice it until the light hits it just right. I had ended a long relationship about 8 months earlier. His name was Derek, and we had been together for nearly 4 years. The breakup was not ugly. It was the opposite, actually. We sat at the kitchen table and talked for 3 hours like two adults who had genuinely loved each other and had slowly, painfully grown into different people. He moved to Phoenix's Scottsdale corridor. I stayed in Tempe near the University District, and we still exchanged polite texts on birthdays. There was nothing to villainize there. It was just over. I had spent those 8 months rebuilding my routines. Work. Early morning walks along the Tempe Town Lake Trail before the heat took over. Thursday evening calls with my sister in Flagstaff. Occasional dinners with coworkers. A short, unremarkable attempt at a dating app that I deleted after 2 weeks because the small talk made me feel like I was filling out a form. The Tuesday in question was the first week of February. Tempe doesn't get cold the way the rest of the country does, but that week it was chilly by local standards, and there was an unusual light rain coming down, steady and soft. I had driven to a coffee shop called Saguaro Grounds on Mill Avenue to pick up a couple of drinks for myself and one of my site coordinators before heading out to an inspection in Chandler. I had ordered ahead on the app, and I was parked in the small lot behind the building, engine running, heat on low, waiting for a text that the order was ready. My car is a dark navy 4-door sedan. Nothing remarkable about it, practical and clean. I had bought it 2 years prior because the fuel economy was solid for the amount of driving my job required. I mention the color because it matters. I was looking down at my phone, reviewing a site diagram, when I heard the passenger door open. I assumed it was a parking lot noise, someone walking past or a cart rolling, but then I felt the seat shift, felt the air pressure change, and looked up to find a man settling himself into my passenger seat with the calm confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. He was around my age, maybe a year or two older. Dark hair cut short on the sides. He was wearing a rust-colored jacket that was slightly damp from the rain and holding a small duffel bag on his lap. He had his phone in one hand and he was looking at it as he pulled the door shut. He said, "Sorry I'm late, the light on University took forever," and only then looked up and found me staring at him. There was a pause. A genuine full pause where time did something odd. His eyes were dark and steady, the kind that don't flicker around a room or a situation but just hold. He looked at me. I looked at him. And then he looked at the dashboard, at the steering wheel, at the seats, and his expression shifted from relaxed to completely mortified. "This is not the ride share," he said. "No," I said. "It is not." He looked back at his phone. He held it up and showed me, almost like presenting evidence, a map on a rideshare app with a blue dot on a dark navy sedan, 2 spots to my left in the same row. "The color is identical," he said. It is a very common car color, I agreed. He put his hand on the door handle. I am so sorry. I can't believe I did that. It's okay, I said, and I meant it, because it was so disarming that I wasn't even remotely bothered. Are you going far? He shook his head. ASU campus. I have a meeting. He opened the door halfway and then looked back at me with a small, rueful smile. I hope I didn't terrify you. You opened a door and sat down, I said. It was more surprising than terrifying. He laughed at that. It was a real laugh, quiet and genuine, and it changed the temperature of the whole car somehow. He stepped out, and I watched him through the windshield as he walked 2 spaces to the left and opened the door of the correct car. He looked back once through the rain and gave a small wave. I gave a small wave back, and that should have been the end of it entirely. But there was something that stayed with me. Not a dramatic romantic thunderclap, nothing like that. More like a small, persistent note that wouldn't stop playing at the back of my head. The way he had held still when he realized his mistake, not panicked, not over-apologized, just assessed and responded. The steadiness of it. The laugh. I picked up my drinks, drove to the Chandler site, spent 2 hours on a rooftop with a clipboard, and did not think about the stranger in my car again until I was driving home that evening, and the memory surfaced completely unprompted. Like a bubble rising in still water, I dismissed it. I am a practical person. Practical people don't spend energy on 5-minute parking lot encounters. I went home, made dinner, called my sister, and went to bed. 3 days later, I walked into Saguaro Grounds for my regular Friday morning coffee and nearly collided with the rust-colored jacket hanging from a chair by the window. He was sitting at a small table with a laptop open, a ceramic mug beside it, and a half-eaten pastry on a paper plate. He looked up at the sound of the door and went perfectly still for exactly 1 second before his mouth curved into a look of complete disbelief. The car, he said. The car, I confirmed. He pointed at the chair across from him. If you're not meeting someone, I feel like this is a sign that the universe wants me to apologize more thoroughly. I looked at the chair. I looked at him, and I said, I've got about 20 minutes before I need to be on the road. I sat down. I ordered at the counter and came back, and for the next 22 minutes, which I know because I checked my phone when I finally stood up, we talked. His name was Carver. Not his last name, his first name. Carver Bly. He had grown up in Flagstaff, which made me laugh because I mentioned my sister lived there, and he looked at me with open amusement and said, You're telling me your last name is Carver and mine is Bly, and we nearly have the same first name? And I said, the universe has a very particular sense of humor. He worked as a sign language interpreter based out of the ASU campus, contracted through the university's Disability Services Office, but also available for off-campus assignments in the Phoenix metro area. He had been doing it for 6 years. He was thoughtful about it in a way that was immediately apparent, talking about the work with precision and care, how interpretation was not just about vocabulary but about pace and intent and the emotional subtext of what someone was actually trying to say. I told him about the solar installation work and braced for the polite nodding people usually gave me. Instead, he asked 3 specific questions about how I managed the gap between what clients expected from a rooftop system and what was structurally realistic, which was actually the most intellectually interesting part of my job and something almost no one ever thought to ask about. When I stood up to leave, I felt the specific friction of not wanting to go. It was so unfamiliar that I almost didn't recognize it. I had gotten so good at being fine with leaving things behind that the desire to stay somewhere caught me completely off guard. I picked up my cup and said, This was a good 22 minutes. He looked up at me with that same steady expression from the parking lot. Are you on Mill Avenue much? Thursday evening sometimes, I said. And most Fridays. I'm here most Fridays, he said. We didn't exchange numbers that day. We didn't make a plan. But we both understood something had begun, and neither of us pretended otherwise. What I didn't know yet, sitting in my car a few minutes later, was that Carver had a story he hadn't told me yet. Something that would change the shape of everything once it came to the surface. Something that would require both of us to slow down, be honest, and make choices that were harder than they looked. But I wouldn't learn any of that until the following Friday, when he was waiting at that same table, and the look on his face was different from before.
I thought about him more than I expected to that week, not in a consuming way, but in the background. While I was reviewing load calculations and taking calls from contractors, some part of my mind kept drifting to that conversation. The ease of it, the realness, the fact that he had asked me a genuine question and then listened to the actual answer. On Friday morning, I walked into Saguaro Grounds at 8:15 and he was already there. Same table, same ceramic mug. But when he looked up this time, something in his face was working through something. I got my coffee and sat down across from him and said, "You look like you've been thinking all week." He wrapped both hands around his mug and said, "I have something to tell you, and I want to tell you before anything goes any further, because I think you're someone who deserves honesty." I set my cup down. I paid attention. He told me that he had been in a relationship for 2 years with a man named Paul, a structural consultant who worked in Scottsdale. They had been living together in an apartment near the Tempe and Mesa border, but the relationship had been quietly fraying for the last several months, and the week before he had wandered into the wrong car, he and Paul had sat down and had an honest conversation about whether they were still building something together or just maintaining the appearance of it. The answer they arrived at was painful and clear. They had agreed to separate. Paul had moved out 4 days before Carver sat in my passenger seat. Carver said, "I want you to know that because I don't want you to feel like you're stepping into something tangled. And I don't want to move so fast that I'm just trying to outrun how hard that was." I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Thank you for telling me. Are you okay with what I just said?" "I think you were honest with him and honest with me," I said. "That's not something I take lightly." We sat with that for a moment. There was no rush in that coffee shop, just the hiss of the espresso machine and the soft sound of rain on the window, because it was raining again, which I later decided was just Tempe's way of marking the important moments. That morning lasted an hour and 40 minutes. We talked about Flagstaff, about his family, about mine. He had 2 older brothers and a mother who had initially needed time to understand who he was, and then had come around fully and became one of his loudest supporters, which he described with a mix of humor and real tenderness. I told him about my own path, how I had come out at 22 to a father who shrugged and said, "I figured," and a mother who cried briefly and then asked if I wanted more chicken, which was her version of moving forward. We talked about the desert. He loved it in a way that went deep, knew the names of plants, could tell you what bloomed in what month along which trail. He hiked South Mountain Park sometimes before sunrise just to catch the Ocotillo in early light. He described it with such specific joy that I felt something shift in my chest, some long-closed valve turning. After that Friday, we started meeting intentionally. Coffee on Fridays became a standing thing, not officially declared, just mutually understood. A few weeks in, we walked the Tempe Town Lake Trail together on a Saturday morning, starting at the Mill Avenue Bridge and following the path east along the water while the city woke up around us. He brought 2 thermoses of coffee from home. That small thoughtfulness, the advanced preparation for someone else's comfort, hit me somewhere quiet. March arrived and warmed quickly, the way Arizona does. We found ourselves at a small outdoor gallery opening in the Tempe Art District one weekend, standing in front of a large photograph of a saguaro against a violet sky, and he said very softly, "I keep thinking about what you said last week, about rooftop angles and light intensity, that you have to study where the shadows fall before you know where the power is." He paused. "I think that's true about a lot of things." I looked at him. He was still looking at the photograph. "Carver," I said. He turned. "I'd like to keep spending time with you, and I want to be clear about what I mean by that." He studied me for a moment with those steady eyes. "Tell me what you mean." "I mean, I want to know you. Past the coffee shop, past the good conversations. I mean, I want to learn what you're actually like." The corner of his mouth lifted. "That is a very careful way of saying something. I'm a project manager," I said. "I plan things." He laughed, and it was even better than the first time. Then he said, "I would really like that, Wells. I'd really like that too." What I did not tell him right then, because I was still untangling it myself, was that I was scared. Genuinely, quietly scared. Not of him, but of how right it felt. After the long and careful silence of the past 8 months, after making peace with my own company and convincing myself I was complete without this, something in me had opened back up, and open things can get hurt. There was also something Carver had said in passing during one of our earlier conversations that I hadn't asked him to explain, and it stayed with me like an open drawer I hadn't gone through yet. He had mentioned once briefly that he had almost left Tempe a year ago, had almost taken a position interpreting for a medical facility in Denver. He said it lightly, like a small piece of history, and then moved on. But I kept thinking about it, about why he hadn't gone, about whether the thing that kept him here was still a factor in his life. I hadn't asked yet. I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever the answer was. But I would ask, and the answer, when it came, would be both simpler and more complicated than anything I had imagined. April in Tempe is the last grace period before the heat becomes serious. The days are warm but not punishing. The desert flowers are extraordinary, and the light in the late afternoon turns everything amber and gold. It was the kind of month that makes you feel like the world is specifically, personally beautiful. Carver and I had been spending several evenings a week together by then. We cooked dinner at my apartment twice. He showed me the South Mountain Trail one Sunday at 5:30 in the morning, and I stood in the half-dark watching the sky go from navy to peach to gold over the saguaro-lined ridgeline and completely understood why he came here before sunrise. He handed me the second thermos and didn't say anything, just let the landscape do what it did. We had not rushed anything. We held hands walking along the lake one evening. That was where we were, tender and careful and deliberate, which felt right for two people who had both recently learned the value of not pretending. Then one Friday evening in mid-April, we were sitting on my apartment's small balcony with takeout containers from a Tempe Thai place we had both separately loved before we met each other, and I finally asked about Denver. He was quiet for a moment. He set down his container. The offer came about 14 months ago, he said. A hospital system there had a full-time staff position, benefits, good pay, interesting work. I got as far as accepting it verbally. Had the paperwork in my inbox. What stopped you? He looked out at the darkening sky, which had gone deep orange along the edges. Paul, he wasn't ready to leave. His work was here. And honestly, I told myself I wasn't ready either. That I loved Arizona. That I was being practical. He turned back to me, but looking back, I think I stayed because I was afraid. Afraid the relationship was already wearing down, and I didn't want to be the one who saw it clearly first. If I stayed, maybe I wouldn't have to look at it. I held that. Did you regret it? I regretted not being honest with myself sooner, he said. But I don't regret staying. Because the things I love about this place are real. And then this February, a stranger was sitting in my car. You were sitting in my car, I corrected. My point stands, he said, and smiled. I leaned forward slightly and said, Is Denver still an open question? He shook his head. I withdrew 2 months ago. The position was filled. He paused. I withdrew because something here felt like it was beginning, and I wanted to see what it was. The weight of that settled between us gently. Not dramatically, just honestly. I was scared to ask you about it, I admitted. I was afraid the answer would be that you were halfway out the door. I know, he said. I could tell, and I kept waiting for you to ask. Why didn't you bring it up? He considered this. Because I wanted to give you time to trust that I was here, not just tell you, show you. I looked at him for a long time. The balcony was small and the city spread out below us was lit up and humming, the warm Arizona evening wrapping around everything like a second atmosphere. Carver, I said, I think I'm falling in love with you. He didn't look surprised. He looked, if anything, like he had been holding his breath for a while and had just let it out. I know I'm falling in love with you, he said quietly. I've known for a while. I just didn't want to say it before you were ready to hear it. There is a particular kind of intimacy in being truly known by someone, not romanticized, not idealized, just seen. Seen with your caution intact, with your history visible, with your imperfect timing, and your delayed questions, and your quiet fear of opening back up after a long stillness. That is what that moment felt like. Not a grand declaration, just two people telling the truth at the same time. We talked for another 2 hours that night, about what we both wanted, practically and emotionally. He was transparent about still doing some work in therapy around the end of his last relationship, and I respected him deeply for naming that. I told him about my own version of the same, the months after Derek, where I had deliberately asked myself hard questions about who I was when I wasn't in someone else's orbit. We talked about pace, about what we needed, about the fact that neither of us wanted to rush into domesticity before we had built something solid underneath it, By the time we cleaned up the takeout containers and he put on his jacket to leave, we had made two small plans. One was a hike to the Peralta Trail in the Superstition Wilderness east of the city on the following Saturday, starting early before the heat. The other was dinner the following Friday at my apartment, which he was going to cook, something he had been offering for weeks and which I had finally accepted. He paused at my door on his way out and turned back. Wells, yeah, that thing you said about the rooftop angles. About studying where the shadows fall before you know where the power is. He held my gaze. You've been doing that. With me. You've been careful and patient and honest. I want you to know that I see it. I didn't have a project manager response for that. I just nodded and he smiled. And then he was gone down the hallway and I stood in my doorway for a moment listening to the elevator close. The weeks that followed had an ordinary beauty that I hadn't expected. Not Hollywood romance, not sweeping gestures. Just Carver at my kitchen counter on a Friday evening, making a tamarind-glazed dish from a recipe his mother had improvised over the years, explaining each step in his precise, attentive way while I sat at the island and asked questions, and the apartment smelled like something warm and specific and new. Just the Peralta Trail at 6 a.m, with the Superstition Mountains going red in the early sun. Him pointing out a hedgehog cactus in bloom tucked behind a boulder. Both of us too winded on a steep section to say much but entirely comfortable in the quiet. Just a Tuesday afternoon when I was sitting in my car in the same coffee shop parking lot, waiting for a call to finish, and he texted me a photo of a saguaro he passed on his way to a campus assignment with a single line that said, "Thought of you." I sat there grinning at my phone like a person who had absolutely no dignity left and found that he did not mind at all. There were harder conversations too, because real things have them. A Sunday in May, when he was tired after a difficult week and I pushed for more than he had to give, and we talked it through honestly the next morning. A moment in June when I caught myself minimizing my own needs out of old habit, and he called it, gently and directly. We got better at it each time. Not perfect, better. By midsummer, it was clear we were building something durable. Clear in the particular way that durable things show themselves. Not with fanfare, but with consistency. With the accumulation of ordinary moments that start to feel irreplaceable. My sister came down from Flagstaff in late June and met him over dinner at a restaurant near the lake. She is a perceptive person and not easily impressed. And on the drive to the airport the next morning, she said, "He listens the way almost no one does. He listens like he's actually thinking." I said, "I know." She said, "Don't be an idiot about this one." I said, "I'm working on it." Carver's mother called me for the first time in July. Carver had told her about me, apparently in considerable detail, and she called just to introduce herself and tell me she was glad he'd found someone grounded. The word she used was grounded. I thought about that for days afterward, about whether I was, and about whether being with him was helping me become more so. I think it was both. There is a question I get asked sometimes when I tell this story to people who know us well. The question is always some version of the same thing. Did you really know, that first moment in the car, that this was something different? And I always answer honestly, which is that, no, I did not know anything that definitive in a parking lot in the rain. What I knew was something smaller and truer, which is that something about him made me want to pay attention, not to manage or plan or protect myself from, but simply to pay attention. And attention, sustained and genuine, is where love actually begins. It does not begin in the dramatic moment. It begins in the 22 minutes at the coffee shop table, in the Friday mornings, in the question asked and the honest answer given, in the thermos handed over on a dark trail before the sun has come up, in the deliberate, unhurried willingness to let someone know who you actually are and to receive who they actually are in return. This is what I know now. What Tempe taught me, what Carver taught me, what that foggy February Tuesday in a parking lot on Mill Avenue eventually taught me. You can plan your routes carefully, know all the side angles, manage every variable, and then someone opens the wrong door, looks at you with a steady gaze in the rain, and everything you thought you had mapped out gets redrawn from the beginning. And if you are paying attention, if you let yourself notice, if you stay instead of drive away, you find that the new map is better than the old one. It takes you somewhere you did not know you were trying to go.